Hi, I'm Edward, and I'm going to talk to you right now about how we teach verbs for SAT writing, particularly with reference to SAT Writing 1. As you're going to see, many of the rules have to do with verbs and whether they're correct or incorrect in a sentence as written. We want to make sure that we're able to explain in concrete yet simple terms why a verb is wrong and the different ways that it can be wrong on the SAT. We don't want students nearly relying on their ear for what sounds wrong. So let's give an overview of the way verbs are taught in SAT Essentials, specifically Writing Lesson 1. And we're going to have three main objectives in this training. The first objective is to talk a little bit about how verbs are tested. We're going to talk about how there are two main categories of verb problems, or two main ways that they're tested. Then we're going to take a look at the three subject-verb agreement rules, rules number 1 through 3, what the differences are between each and how we should teach them, and then 16 rules numbers 4 through 6, which are the three remaining rules about verbs, particularly tense and verb form. Okay, so let's get started. I have two sentences written here on the board. Both of them are incorrect. Cassandra bring books to the library. Yesterday, Cassandra brings books to the library. Let's underline the verbs and take a look at why they're wrong. These represent the two different ways that verbs are tested on the SAT, broadly speaking. And this relates to the section of the text starting on page 7 that talks about understanding verbs on the SAT. So the first example, right, and the second example, they both may sound wrong to native speakers, right? But there are really concrete differences in terms of how they're wrong. Cassandra bring books to the library. Excuse me, bring is the verb here. The problem here is the form of the verb. We don't say Cassandra bring, we say Cassandra brings. This is called an agreement error. The problem is with how the subject and the verb relate to each other. We can't say Cassandra bring, we say Cassandra brings. Now let's look at the second example. Yesterday, Cassandra brings books to the library. Here the problem is not agreement, right? Cassandra brings, in and of itself, is correct. But the logic of the sentence, particularly the time reference, yesterday, shows us that we shouldn't say Cassandra brings using the simple present. Rather, we need to use a past tense verb form. So we wouldn't say yesterday Cassandra brings, we would say yesterday Cassandra brought. Would be the correct form of the verb. And this is a basic overview of how verbs are tested. In the rest of this little section of understanding verbs on the SAT, we're really just trying to lay the groundwork for what students are going to learn later, namely the 5 verb tenses that we care about: the simple present, the simple past, the future, the present perfect, and the past perfect, what those forms are. And we're trying to have students understand that sometimes we have simple verb tenses like brought, simple meaning one word, and other times we have a complex verb tense such as has brought, here the present perfect, and we call it complex because it has 2 parts, and simple because it has 1 part. Now, the point of understanding all of this is not for students to have mastery, but rather in this understanding verbs, we're trying to teach this very basic dichotomy between an agreement error and a tense error. And we're trying to have them recognize some of the important fundamentals we're going to teach more in depth later on, namely the 5 verb tenses, simple versus complex verbs, and then one other thing would be the verb fragments, the infinitive, the gerund, also known as the present participle form, and the past participle form. Okay? And the reason why we teach these verb fragments is they're really important later on for rules 5 and 6, and they're exceptionally important in the lesson on sentence fragment in Writing Lesson 2. Okay? So the first thing to realize and to teach students is there are two different ways that verbs are tested: agreement and tense. Got it? Good. Let's talk about subject-verb agreement now, rules 1 to 3. Let's understand the mechanics of these questions, why they're difficult, why we don't want to rely merely on sound to identify the errors, and how we want to teach them to students by looking at some key examples in the book. So, if I turn to page 14, I have rule number 1, subject and verb are separated. So let me erase my board and set that up really quickly. Now, we saw earlier an example of an agreement error. Cassandra bring books. That's wrong, it should be Cassandra brings. Well, the three subject-verb agreement rules, 1 through 3, are really resting on that same fundamental grammatical principle. But the difference is in how this principle is tested. The first way it's tested is we take the subject and we take the verb, ordinarily beside each other, and we separate them and put a bunch of junk in the middle to confuse students to mask a subject-verb agreement error. Let's take a look at the second example in the book, which is probably the most representative of what's going to come up on the test. The team of Little League All-Stars train vigorously every day. I'm going to put ... here. I don't need to write the whole thing for the sake of this training video. The team of Little League All-Stars train every day. So here we have a verb, train, and we have a subject, team. We know that this is wrong. There's an agreement error. Not the team train, but the team trains. But rule number 1, the particular of it, and this is how it's going to appear most often on the exam, is we have something separating the subject from the verb. Here, what's separating the subject from the verb is a prepositional phrase. Like most prepositional phrases on the SAT, it begins with the preposition of. Now, to a student, somewhere deep down in their brain subconsciously, this all-stars is registering. But this all-stars cannot be the subject because it's part of the prepositional phrase. So even though a student somewhere subconsciously might register all-stars train, that sounds good. The real subject of the sentence is team. And the error is masked by the fact that the subject and the verb are separated, in this case by a prepositional phrase. Now let's take a look at the second rule related to subject-verb agreement and see how it's different. Rule number 2 is called subject-verb agreement, verb before subject. Now oftentimes this rule is going to have the phrase there is or there are. And we definitely want to train students to pick up on this phrase, there is or there are, to recognize this error. But the example I'm going to use works just as well. It's from the book, the second example, and it doesn't have there is or there are. So this is rule number 2, subject-verb agreement, verb before subject. And the example sentence here is, through the Panama Canal sails the ships of the U.S. Navy. And I'm going to put ... here. Don't need to write the entire sentence to show how to teach this one. So with this sentence, through the Panama Canal sails the ships, it's easy to identify the verb, sails. But we need to ask ourselves, what is the subject of this sentence? Or, what is doing the sailing? The answer here is the ships. And the reason why this subject-verb agreement error is masked is because, unlike most sentences in English, we have the verb before the subject. So deep down in subconscious, what is a student going to recognize possibly as the subject of the verb? Well, maybe the noun that precedes it, Panama Canal. And in and of itself, Panama Canal sails does agree. But Panama Canal is not the subject. Panama Canal is just a noun that occurs before the subject, which is preceded by the verb sails. Okay? We could also take note of the fact that through is a preposition, and hence this whole thing is a prepositional phrase. And we know that the prepositional phrase can never contain the subject in English grammar. So here we see subject-verb agreement, an error that's masked by the fact that we have the verb before the subject. So that's the second way that it's tested. Now let's take a look at the third way that it's tested, which has to do with confusing sentence structure that can make the subject seem plural when really it's not. And I'm going to take a look at an example from the book I'm going to look at the first example. Neither diabetes nor obesity were prevalent, ... So here we have an example of a very specific sentence structure organized around the parallel pair neither nor that we learn more about later on in lessons on parallelism. Well, this sentence structure, neither diabetes nor obesity, can create confusion. Since we have two nouns here, it seems as if the subject is plural. However, with a construction like this, we need to recognize that subject seems plural may be tested and recognize that the rule says we always follow the subject in the second position. So, just judging from obesity and ignoring this part of the sentence, we wouldn't say obesity were, we'd say obesity was. Were, of course, is the verb here. Okay, so here we have a sentence structure that makes it seem as if the subject is plural, when really the rule says follow the second position. This is the same as with either or. Now, there are some other common sentence structures that involve prepositional phrases we're going to take a look at in the second example. So if we take a look at the second example, LSAT performance, as well as university grades and letters of rec, are among the factors, ... Again, I'm going to put ... just to make this a little bit more efficient here. Now here, we have as well as. This is another common phrase that we're going to see that technically counts as a prepositional phrase, which is going to bring us back to our rule about prepositional phrases. The subject can't be in them. But this can be confusing because when students see as well as, logically, it registers as and. Right? When I say as well as, logically it means the same thing as and. But grammatically, as well as does not mean the same thing as and. Rather, it's a sentence structure that creates confusion by introducing a parallel phrase that logically seems to mean the same thing as and. But really, grammatically, we cannot count it as part of the subject because it's part of a prepositional phrase. So instead, we have to ignore the whole thing and take a look at LSAT performance. Is among should be the verb. And I want to make a note here, guys, where we're on it, to the fact that were or was, are, and is, these verbs, students sometimes don't recognize as verbs because they don't represent a very concrete action, such as running or jumping or playing or writing or reading, right? They're more state of being verbs as opposed to action verbs. But we need to train students to look for these types of verbs, were, was, is, are, as well as has, have, had, because these come up a lot in agreement type errors. So those are the three ways that subject-verb agreement is tested. Subject and verb are separated, verb before subject seems plural due to a confusing sentence structure, such as neither nor or as well as ... This group of three corresponds to the first way that verbs are tested on the SAT. Agreement issues. Cassandra bring books to the library. Now let's take a look at the ones that have to do more with the form of the verb and how it operates within a formal verb tense. So let's fast forward to rule number 4.